This is Jamie with So Happy, and today we're going to be making a standard size pillowcase. It's a really easy beginner project, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to be doing is cutting out our pieces of fabric. We need to cut out one big piece that's going to be the main part of the pillowcase, and then a strip that'll be the border for the pillowcase. So we're going to start off by cutting out the real big piece that's supposed to be, I believe, 26.5 by 40.5 inches. So I have my fabric all laid out. You can see that the pattern on the fabric is kind of going in all different directions, and that's kind of the ideal for these pillowcases, because if you use something that's more one directional, so like for example, see, this print is really cute, but all the cats are going kind of in the same direction. And so with the way that this pattern is, like one side of the pillowcase, all of the kitties are going to be right side up, but on the back side of the pillowcase, they'll all be upside down. So it's better to pick a fabric where all of your pattern is kind of going all over the place, so you can't really tell what direction things are going in. Okay. So I just have it laid out where it's kind of folded in half, kind of just how it comes off the bolt. We're going to measure, well, first of all, you should probably measure the length here. Mine just happens to be 40.5 inches going across this way, so I don't need to change that. Yours might be a little bit longer, and so you may have to trim it down a little bit. But so since this, once I unfold it, since this is going to be my 40.5, then I need to measure my 26.5 going this direction. This edge is kind of not very even. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make myself a straight line to measure from. So I'm just going to draw a nice straight line, and I'm going to cut this off later. Like that. And then I'm going to take my measuring tape and I'm going to put this 26.5 that's right here, I'm going to put that right on this blue line that I drew for myself. And right where the edge of my measuring tape is, I'm going to just make a little mark. And then I'm going to move it up, making sure that my measuring tape is straight. I've got my 26.5 right on that line that I drew, and then I'm going to make a mark right on the end. I'm going to do this all the way up, and that's going to give me a bunch of little dots that then I can connect the dots, and I'll have a nice, perfectly straight line. So do maybe one more up here. Okay, so now I'm going to connect my lines with my ruler. Here. Just that right there. And go up like that. All right, perfect. Okay, so now I am going to make my cuts. So go ahead and just cut this off right here. My fabric's a little bit wrinkly, so you can always iron it before you do this too. That would probably be the best idea. Okay, so I cut that off, and now I'm just going to cut off this kind of uneven edge where I made this mark earlier. All right, so now I have a piece that is 26.5 inches going this way, and if I open it up and unfold it, going this direction, this is going to be 40.5 inches. If yours is a little bit longer, you can always lay it out and measure with your measuring tape your 40.5 inches from one end to the other, and do the same thing to trim off the extra. You just find your 40.5, like let's say it was right here. I find my 40.5, I make my mark, and then move it down. Make my mark, and make my line so that I can also cut off any extra. And so then you just have a piece that is 40.5 inches by 26.5 inches. So now we're ready to cut our border. Okay, so here is our border fabric. So for this piece, we're going to need something that is 10.5 inches by 40.5 inches. So I have it folded just like we did in the other one, just like it comes off the bolt. And we're going to measure out the 10.5 inches first. So this end right here is pretty straight, so I'm just going to measure from that edge. So I've got my 10.5 inches on my measuring tape, and I'm going to put that right on the edge of the fabric, and then I'm going to make a mark. Okay, so then I'm going to move it up a little bit, still my 10.5 on the end of the fabric. I'm going to make a little mark. And I'm going to keep doing that all the way up. Just like that. Okay, so now I have a bunch of little lines, which are probably kind of hard for, it's probably impossible for everybody to see right now. I'm going to switch to some white chalk so you can see me draw my line. But I'm going to connect these little dots right here so that I have a nice straight line. Just like this. There, and so that's my 10.5 inches. So now that we have our line, we're going to cut right on that line. All right, and so now we have a strip that is 10.5 inches wide, but mine is actually about 44 inches long. And I don't want it to be 44 inches long because I need it to be 40.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is take my measuring tape, and I know probably a lot of this is off camera for you guys, but I'm going to measure from the end of my fabric to 40.5, and I'm going to make a little mark here. And I'm going to do the same thing that we've been doing. So all the way down, I've got my 40.5. I'll make one more mark. And there's our 40.5 again. All right, and then I'm going to take my ruler and connect those dots. And then we'll trim off the excess so that we'll have a nice piece that is exactly 10.5 by 40.5 inches long. Like that. All right, so the first step in sewing all of this together is we're going to take this border piece right here, and the instructions say that we need to fold it in half with the wrong sides together. So if we look at our fabric, so there's a right side and there's a wrong side where the pattern isn't as pretty. Okay, so this is our right side, this is our wrong side. So we want to fold it with wrong sides together in half lengthwise, like this. You want to try to get it as even as possible. You don't want to have it kind of like that. You want to make sure those edges are nice and lined up. And you're going to take this to the iron and press it in half so that it stays nice and flat. All right, so the next step after you have ironed your border piece in half is we're going to start pinning that border piece to the edge of our big piece. So let's lay out the big piece with our 40.5 inches, that long edge right there like that. And we're going to put raw edges together. The raw edge is just this kind of rough edge right here. And it's the same thing with the pillowcase fabric right there. So we're going to line up these raw edges together. So you don't, this is kind of the folded edge up here. And these are the raw edges down here together. And we're lining those up like that. And then we're going to take some pins and we're going to pin this raw edge together like that. And you don't have to put a ton of pins in it, but you can put a pin every few inches just to kind of keep that edge together. And I like to pin it with the sharp point of the pin sort of pointing towards this raw edge. They're easier to take out as you're sewing when you do that. We get this pinned all the way down. Okay, and then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this to the machine and we're going to be sewing along this edge that we've pinned. All right, so we are going to be sewing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance down this whole edge. So 1/2 inch on my machine is right where the edge of the presser foot meets the edge of the fabric, which is a nice easy guide, but it may not be the same on your machine. So if you have a seam gauge like this, you can have it set at 1/2 inch and you can kind of measure from the edge to see where you need to put your needle down. Okay, so you can see that mine, if I put my seam gauge on the end, my needle is right there at that 1/2 inch, and so that's where I need to be. All right, so we are going to start sewing, and we want to make sure to reinforce or do our reverse button or lever or whatever you have on your machine to reinforce those stitches. So I always tell my students that we go 1, 2, 3 stitches forward, and then I'm going to push my reverse button, or it might be a lever on yours. I'm going to hold it down, 1, 2, 3, and that kind of makes the machine go backwards and tie the knot, and then we're just going to start sewing forward. Now before you get to a pin, you want to take this out. I'm doing this one-handed, so I don't know how good this is going to be. All right. Straighten everything out here. And you'll just continue on this way the whole way down. Alright, so now we should have a nice seam sewn along this whole edge right here at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And we want to take this raw edge and kind of make it so it doesn't fray so much, especially once you wash this. All these little threads are going to start coming off. So there's a couple of different things you can do. You can actually just run this through the sewing machine with a zigzag stitch right along the edge, and that'll kind of keep it from fraying. I prefer the easier method, and I use something called pinking shears. So you can see these are those scissors that have those triangle teeth. And I like to do this to finish my seams because it's super quick and easy. So the way that you do this is you do not want to cut too close to the seam that you just sewed, because then that would be bad. You'd have a hole. But we're just kind of cutting this little edge off. And let me bring this up closer so you can kind of see what it's doing here. So see, there's my seam, and then you can see where I'm cutting it. And that's just to get that raw edge off of there. And this actually will fray a lot less than if you just left it. So we're going to go ahead and use the pinking shears along this whole seam all the way down. And there we go. The next thing we want to do is we want to press with the iron this seam that we just did. So we want it, because once it opens up, it'll look nice and pretty like this. We want our seam, so see, the seam can go either towards the border piece, or it can lay flat pointing towards the main fabric piece. We want it to lay pointing that way, toward the main fabric piece. So when you take this to the iron, you can lay it down on this side here, oops, and just press it so that this nice little triangle edge you just cut is pointing towards your main fabric piece. We want it to lay nice and flat that way.